innovation, science, the technological breakthrough, and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomum. Monday, only on teleSUR. From here to beyond the south. From here to the Caribbean or further north. Where can I see news connecting the whole south? From Washington. From Mexico. From Caracas. From Quito. From Havana. You can always see the news from a new vision, connecting the global south, only on teleSUR.
Infested by inequalities, abuse of power, and injustice. The American journalist Abby Martin covers the struggle for fundamental rights worldwide, deepening into the search of files which uncover the empire's strategies through our screen and web platform in English. The Empire Files with Abby Martin. Tuesday, only on teleSUR.
From here to beyond the south. From here to the Caribbean or further north. Where can I see news connecting the whole south? From Washington. From Mexico. From Caracas. From Quito. From Havana. You can always see the news from a new vision, connecting the global south, only on teleSUR.
Bolivian social and political leaders call for guarantees as the electoral process advances. Jamaica is taking steps to address a deadly dengue crisis.
And receive cabinet subsidy.
And the law controlling women's conduct is repealed in Sudan. Hello and welcome to teleSUR. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. Lawmakers from Bolivia's movement towards socialism are demanding justice and legal guarantees as the country moves towards fresh elections. On Thursday, the Legislative Assembly approved the regulations for the election of members of a new Supreme Electoral Court. This was one of the steps agreed on Sunday when the de facto President Julian Assange signed off on an electoral law agreed by the Assembly. The new regulations were passed on Thursday evening by over two-thirds of the lawmakers, including those of Evo Morales' MAS party. The members of the Electoral Court must be in place within 20 days, and they will then call fresh elections, probably for April or May next year. Members of Evo Morales' MAS party are supporting the move towards new elections, but they insist there can be no democracy unless there's also respect for human rights and justice for those killed, injured and abused in the last 3 weeks. Adriana Salvatierra, the former Speaker of the Bolivian Senate and a possible presidential candidate in the coming elections, spoke exclusively to teleSUR.
As long as they continue arresting members of our political movement and leaders of the social movements, especially campesinos, workers, teachers, community leaders in El Alto, often in a completely irregular manner. So long as no one is held to account for the killing of all those people, so long as there is no compensation for the victims of the military and police violence, there are no democratic guarantees for taking part in the elections. So what we are demanding are these legal and constitutional guarantees, so that President Evo Morales can accompany the election campaign. He and Álvaro García Linera will no longer be candidates for the president and vice president, but what we're asking for is respect for the basic rights of all Bolivian citizens, so that they should be free to take part in the election campaign and be able to move around freely in their own country.
And as the process towards new elections following the coup in Bolivia advances, the decree granting a carte blanche for repression has been repealed. Our correspondent in La Paz, Mateo Grier, has the latest.
Of ministers, and has anybody been arrested? No. And that's why I'm calling this news conference. There's no investigations, no arrests. But recently,
given to the police and military to interfere and repress demonstrations without consequence for excesses in the name of so-called public order. This was a key demand of social movements in return for lifting roadblocks that had been in place since the coup d'etat in Bolivia. They have also been calling for a law that will guarantee the human rights of all Bolivians and an end to the persecution of movement towards socialism members and their leaders. So the 4078 law has been repealed, and what's left is a law to ensure guarantees. Beyond an end to the persecution of political and social leaders, there are also calls for those responsible for repression and the more than 30 killings since the coup to be held accountable.
That was our correspondent Mateo Grier with that report. Colombians are rejecting the proposed neoliberal reforms of President Ivan Duque as demonstrations enter their 9th day. Protests continued into the night throughout the country. A national strike is ongoing, with many social sectors throwing their weight behind the mobilizations. The measures introduced by the Duque administration would privatize basic services and directly prejudice the poorest in Colombia. Citizens also condemned the government's failure to implement the 2016 peace agreements and the killing of social leaders throughout the country. The indigenous guard from the Department of Cauca have joined the protests in the capital, Bogotá. The leaders of several indigenous communities have said they're joining the strike to reject the new economic measures, state crimes like the murder of Dylan Cruz, and the killing of 8 children in a bombing in Caqueta. Meanwhile, an autopsy report in Colombia says the young protester who died on Monday was killed with a 12-bore shotgun. The death of 18-year-old Dylan Cruz has been at the center of protests since he was shot by riot police at a demonstration last Saturday. He died in hospital 2 days later. Chilean media outlet Prensa is denouncing the persecution of one of its journalists covering demonstrations in the country. The independent media channel says that the Carabineros threatened their journalist and demanded a personal address during an identity check, something which isn't within the unit's remit. They added that their journalists have been beaten while covering the protests, calling for the dismantling of the neoliberal state. They identify Lieutenant Colonel Claudio Crespo Guzman as the culprit. Leaders of the Social Unity Platform, which has been coordinating many of the protests in Chile, have been meeting with the government. Our correspondent, Leonel Retamal, reports.
We're outside the Moneda Presidential Palace, where a meeting has just taken place between trade unionists of the Social Unity Platform and the government. One of the teachers' leaders is just explaining to some of his members what happened at the meeting, the demands put forward by the unions, not just teachers, but construction workers, dockers and other unions that make up the CUT Confederation. These are the unions that have been leading many of the protests in Chile, most recently the general strike on Tuesday this week. They say the government was prepared to listen to them, But there has been no concrete response to their demands, nor was an agenda of talks agreed. Nonetheless, this is the first such meeting between the government and the organizations that have been mobilizing after more than 40 days of the uprising. They say they raised the issue of human rights abuses, the 280 or so cases of eye injuries, the 2,600 formal complaints registered for violations of human rights. They talked about their 10-point list of social demands, including an increase in the minimum wage and the issues of pensions, education, healthcare and others. And also the question of a constitutional referendum in April. They want the government to suspend its legislative plans, which the protesters say do not correspond to their demands, but just deepen the existing neoliberal policies.
Coming up, a Caribbean government wants to set a time limit on the term of a prime minister. We'll tell you who and why after the break.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en él.
Dotting the I. Saturdays, only on teleSUR.
Welcome back. In some Caribbean news, Jamaicans are being warned to take the country's current dengue outbreak seriously and take measures to stop the spread of infections and deaths. Health Minister Dr. Christopher Tufton told the Parliament that as of November 7th, there were 61 suspected or confirmed deaths, 17 of which were or occurred in 2018 and 44 in 2019. He assured that the government is already taking steps to address the outbreak.
Mr. Speaker, given the intensity of this dengue outbreak, I have sought and received Cabinet's approval to enhance our intervention over the next 3 to 6 months. This intervention, Mr. Speaker, will see the allocation of some $1 billion Jamaican dollars expenditure over the next 3 months to enhance the existing program that is taking place. Our enhanced intervention includes the establishment, Mr. Speaker, of a National Dengue Coordination Committee, as we seek to include a multi-sectorial, multi-agency, coordinated approach.
The government of St. Kitts and Nevis has tabled the Constitution of St. Christopher and Nevis Tenure of Office of Prime Minister Amendment Bill 2019. The proposed legislation seeks to establish term limits for prime ministers. In leading the historic debate on Thursday, Head of Government Dr. Timothy Harris stressed its importance towards ensuring that citizens' needs are met.
We see in Zimbabwe, President Mugabe, he was a leader for life until he got thrown out. We see in Libya, there was a Gaddafi, he was leader for life until he got thrown out. And we ask ourselves, which of these models of governance are better, appeal to us as a people, that we would want to do some adaptation of them? Do we want a leader for life so that our country can go to the depths of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe to become a failed state? Or we want something much more appealing and uplifting that give all people an opportunity and a chance?
Dominica's Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit has condemned an Al Jazeera documentary alleging the sale of diplomatic passports, labeling it a conspiracy created by the opposition. He says the false claims have been shared by the United Workers' Party for years and threatened legal action for defamation.
It was clear to me, as it will be to you, that either Linton, the UWP directly, or their foreign collaborators provided this baseless information to Al Jazeera for political reasons. People who libel me will find themselves before the courts.
Shifting gears now, Peru is putting up its own candidate for Secretary General of the Organization of American States to stand against the incumbent Luis Almagro. Hugo de Zela Martinez is a former vice foreign minister and Peru's current ambassador to the OAS. His candidacy indicates splits within the Lima group, which Almagro helped to set up to press for regime change in Venezuela. The former president of the UN General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who was Ecuador's foreign minister under Rafael Correa, has also confirmed she will stand. The candidate of the governing Broad Front in Uruguay has conceded defeat in last Sunday's presidential election. In a tweet, Daniel Martinez said the counting of special votes had not changed the tendency shown on Sunday night. He was therefore congratulating Luis Lacalle Pou as president-elect. He said he would meet his rival on Friday. Sunday's results gave the right-wing Lacalle a lead of less than 30,000 votes, which meant no official result was possible until the special votes were counted. Small groups of Lacalle supporters gathered to celebrate his victory in Montevideo. The right-wing leader has already been congratulated by the Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaidó, and he in turn expressed his support for Guaidó. In Brazil, the persecution by the far-right government against landless campesinos is growing. Stopping the agrarian reform evictions and plans to criminalize rural workers are raising concerns among social movements.
The Brazilian constitution says that the state-owned lands need to be prioritized for our agrarian reform. 4 years ago, a public area in the city of Paraná, where a company was illegally located, was occupied by the landless workers movement, making way for the Maria Rosa do Constatado camp. Negotiations for the concession of a new space for families were underway, but the parliament coup changed the situation.
Polls indicated that if Lula went to prison, Bolsonaro would win the presidency. I think he sums up the worst things that a human being can be. He is a person who is not prepared to be in such a position. Seeing his victory in the wings, the Dutch owners of Castrolanda wanted to tear up the contract because they knew they'd have support from this neo-fascist group.
Today, the 200 families in the camp are at risk of eviction. Under the complexity of the government with the agribusiness, the fate of the landless movement could be lost on the sides of the roads or among the homeless in the larger cities.
If the eviction is carried out, our families will have to go to other camps to avoid living on the street. At this juncture, with this government, we are in danger. We are resisting with these families.
Meanwhile, Bolsonaro is preparing a bill that would allow an action to protect against the invasion of private property. He also plans to authorize federal intervention in land evictions.
We have medicines, penicillin, migraine remedies, sweet potato that is excellent for high blood pressure, and many things that save us from spending in the pharmacy as we earn so little.
In the last week, 2 evictions took place in the landless camps located in the northeast of the country. In Paraná, one of the modern cities for the consolidation of the agrarian reform, 8 evictions have already been registered. In the capital of the state, the MST played a fundamental role in campaigning for the freedom of former President Lula.
The attacks on MST camps and the evictions in Paraná clearly seek to wear down the movement and to give it a bad name for the support that it gave to the Lula Libre vigil. The MST was part of the vigil. That's part of their project.
The development model based on the use of agroecology for the production of food, as opposed to using agrotoxin, has earned the landless movement the support of various sectors of the Brazilian society.
After the break, we take an in-depth look at a Julian Assange solidarity event in London. Stick around.
innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Activism. Monday, only on teleSUR.
Welcome back. Sudan's transitional authorities have approved a law to dissolve the former ruling party and repeal the public order used to regulate women's behavior under ousted President Omar al-Bashir. Following a 14-hour marathon meeting, Sudan's Sovereign Council and Cabinet voted to dissolve Bashir's National Congress Party, making way for its assets to be seized. This will be a crucial test for how far transitional authorities will go to overturn nearly 3 decades of rule following the 1989 coup. The two measures respond to key demands by a protest movement that helped overthrow Bashir in April.
The first law simply cancels all the laws pertaining to the public order, which we all know have an impact on every family or most families in Sudan, especially the ones belonging to certain social classes, who are harmed more than others because of the implementation of these laws. The second law, and the most important one, is in accordance with the constitutional document, which aims to rebuild the Sudanese state by dismantling the June 30 regime and ending the empowerment of the regime. This law directly dissolves the National Congress Party, as well as confiscating all assets and money owned by the party and all the institutions belonging to it. These assets will be under the control of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning.
The president of Guinea-Bissau, José Mario Vaz, has admitted defeat in the presidential election held on Sunday. Running as an independent, Vaz came in 4th place. He made history as the first democratically elected president to survive a full 5-year term since the country gained independence from Portugal in 1974. A runoff is expected to take place on December 29th between former Prime Ministers Domingos Simoe Pereira and Umaro Sissoko Embalo, competing for the top job.
It is with a clear conscience that I will leave my country. I will live in peace, because during my mandate, I never killed anyone, never took anything from anyone, never lied, never tortured, never violated anyone's rights. I have done my duty as President of the Republic.
Protesters around the world are demanding radical action to combat climate change. A global strike began in Australia ahead of the COP25 United Nations Climate Conference in Madrid. Australia's government lacks a coherent climate policy and is one of the countries already being affected by man-made climate change with extreme heat, severe weather and the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. There are currently 150 uncontrolled bushfires burning in the country. The Sydney demonstration was one of the first to take place today.
Now is the time to take action. Now is the time to show our bosses and to show our politicians that we have the power to shut down the system. We have the power to make the decisions about what gets built, about how our energy is produced, and about what society we want to live in.
Now, the COP25 summit begins in Spain on Monday, December 2nd, and activists are preparing for the arrival of delegates from around the world. Greenpeace activists in Madrid hung banners on buildings highlighting corporate interests and consumerism's adverse effects on the battle against climate change. Academics and artists held an event in the British capital, London, condemning the continued incarceration of Julian Assange on Thursday. The WikiLeaks founder has been jailed since April and risks extradition to the United States after exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq. He's been described as Britain's most important political prisoner right now.
Here in the centre of London, in the St Pancras Church, around 500 people have gathered to hear various speakers talk about the case of the imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, who since April has been in the high security Belmarsh prison in South London. We've heard from historians, British historians such as Mark Curtis, from the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Nils Meltzer, and from the Australian journalist and good friend of Julian Assange, John Pilger, who described visiting him in prison today and the ordeal that entailed. So around 400 people here have gathered in a solidarity meeting for the imprisoned WikiLeaks founder and journalist Julian Assange, who since April has been detained by the British authorities now that the Swedish investigation into alleged sex crimes has been terminated by Sweden. The British government will be making a decision on whether to extradite him to the US to face what has been described as political accusations for his disclosure of US government documents. It has been described here today as the most important political prisoner that Britain has, and John Pilger called on a new Jeremy Corbyn government to do everything within its power to free Julian Assange.
The Prime Minister of Iraq, Adel Abdul Mahdi, says he will resign after more than 40 people were killed in protests on Thursday. There were celebrations in the streets of Baghdad after the announcement. Thursday was the bloodiest day so far in nearly 2 months of protests against the lack of jobs and services, as well as corruption among politicians. The protesters want a complete change in the political system.
Iraqi people are happy because Adel Abdul Mahdi has resigned, but we consider this as the first step. We demand the resignation of all lawmakers. We call on the judiciary to put them on trial immediately.
And on the International Day of Solidarity with Palestine, we end with the news that Israel continues to demolish Palestinian homes in the occupied territories of the West Bank. On Thursday, Israeli forces said the homes being demolished were property of the alleged attackers of an Israeli soldier.
The Israeli security forces demolished the house. They arrested some people. We've become homeless, me and my 10 children. And not only us, but they demolished my relatives' homes and other houses on the other side of the village.
That brings us to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, remember you can find us on Starsat Channel 461 in South Africa and Channel 539 in Nigeria. And join us on social media. For TeleSUR English, I'm Doris Folo. Thanks for watching.